I could think of no better person to come in than Lindsay Martyn, who is the Director of Business Development for humm. So Lindsay brings over 6 years of experience to her role as Director of Business Development at humm. Her expertise includes building dynamic sales teams, coordinating cross-departmentally to incorporate a broad range of sales strategies, and forging and sustaining exceptional relationships. She helps partners in the healthcare sector to establish and evolve financing programs that will drive revenue growth and increase treatment conversions. Hello, Lindsay.
Hi, Danielle, and good morning, everyone.
How are you?
I am great. How are you all doing?
I'm good, good. Everybody say hello to Lindsay. We're very happy that you're here to share everything. No pressure, no pressure at all. But let's just jump right on in.
Yeah.
So from your experience in working with humm, how many entrepreneurs have you seen essentially like come into using humm and then being able to branch out with other corporate relationships and be able to grow from that?
Yeah, so it is constantly an evolving market. Kind of you outlined it really well there. Just from your perspective of your business, it's something that's a trend that kind of we see all small businesses and entrepreneurs experiencing. The landscape of partnerships has really changed, and COVID was a big piece of that. The momentum had kind of started before that, but utilizing something like humm or other strategic partnerships that increase accessibility, whether that's through affordability or through market reach to your product and to your brand, are really becoming an incremental part of the business. And it's a big focus that we see everyone shifting towards.
Amazing. And something that I even just love that you just said was the accessibility piece. Can you share a little bit more about how humm kind of increases accessibility for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so for anyone who's not familiar with humm or with another buy now, pay later financing provider, what we do is we work with the merchant or the business owner to create a payment plan for their providers, or sorry, for their clients or customers. So the way that that works is that the person has more access to their product or service by being able to split that purchase into more affordable monthly payments. So in different verticals that we work in or with different merchants that we're working with, we'll break that out into different plan structures that make sense for their clientele and the market that they're trying to reach. It's something that the world is so used to these days, having things on a subscription model with a monthly payment. But it's just not something that we see in kind of all the non-traditional verticals like healthcare, auto, kind of some of those other retail areas that just aren't as used to it as things like home appliances, where you've always been able to go put a fridge on layaway and pay for it later. So by bringing this kind of as a more standard option and into other areas of the market, we're helping these merchants provide accessibility.
Amazing. So, can you share a case study or example where a strategic partnership significantly increased either humm or one of your clients' brands?
So like you mentioned, we were fairly new to the Canadian market. We've been launched in Canada. I think we're coming up on our 3-year anniversary now. We've been globally around for 30 years. We were able to pull a lot of those best practices and some of those relationships from other markets, but it is essentially a startup environment when you're in a new market. So for us, we really had to try and figure out a partnership that could help us achieve scale when we're still working with a very small team. Our product is still very much in the development phase. So one of the partners that we worked with is Henry Schein. They're a leading provider in the dental supply space. And that partnership is a little bit non-traditional in the sense that they weren't the end user for our product. They're essentially an association that gave us access to over 7,000 practices who would be potential customers for us. And it just gave us the ability to really focus our resources in unlocking the potential of that partnership and getting our product out to a kind of pocket of people versus having to try and approach 7,000 practices all on our own. It would just take us so much longer to unlock that type of revenue.
Yeah, no, that is so true. That like when you are able to tap into another company that already has an established market and then be able to use that to create brand exposure,
Mhm.
It's so much more efficient and effective, and I cannot understate that enough for people. So for anyone who is like currently listening and taking notes, if you are able to find a company that already has a network and be able to partner and collaborate, utilize that.
The other thing those partnerships can do for you too is, especially when you're kind of in the phase, you want to obviously make sure you're confident in your product before you approach a group of that size, but there's
Mhm.
always going to be room for evolution. And when you work with a partner like that, you're able to get a lot of insight into best practices. You're able to like collect feedback a lot quicker, and then you can use that information to kind of adjust your presentation or your product and take it to the market and other competitors or other partners in that market with a kind of revised version of what you thought you'd be bringing.
Amazing. And so with all of that, how do you have like a process or steps that you use to measure, the potential of a market before entering it?
Yeah, so the best starting place is always what data do you have accessible to you? Is that spender habits within the market, the average transaction size, how often people are purchasing that product or repurchasing that product or service. Another good thing to look at is how saturated that market is with other competitors. But the most important thing for you to look at before you go into a market is to really understand what it is that you do differently and the value that you bring to that market. And then the best way to assess the value is to find that niche pocket that you can start satisfying a need that someone else isn't already satisfying. And from there, you can grow and expand your product into finding other pockets of the market that you can continuously develop into. But by able to focus on a specific pocket first, you're able to unlock the full value of something that maybe another provider or similar business isn't already doing. And then you can continue to add more value to the rest of the market.
Yeah. Something that we usually hear back from a lot of our entrepreneurs is that they feel like their market is like very oversaturated. They think that what they're doing is special, but they just feel like there's so many different players in the game. There's, companies that are significantly bigger than them, plus everybody else who's in the market. What would you say to someone who's trying to figure out how to differentiate themselves in a market and find their particular niche?
Yeah, and that's not always the easiest thing to do, especially in certain verticals where, like you mentioned, it is extremely oversaturated, and there's lots of people trying to do the same thing. But people can tell when you believe in what you're doing and you feel that your product does do something different. Obviously, you want to make sure that your product has the ability to back that confidence up, but it's not always the easiest thing to put on paper what your differentiator is. And sometimes your differentiator isn't actually the product yourself, but it's the value that working with you brings. So if your product isn't something that's able to clearly be defined as different from the next person down the street, make sure that working with you is what the difference is. Make sure you're able to build those strong relationships, bring more to the table than the next person in terms of a growth strategy, how to expand into new markets, how to get the most out of current markets, and something different. A lot of the times we see that these larger groups or other competitors that you might be worried that you can't go up against are sitting at the top with the largest partners simply because no one's tried to challenge them before and no one's brought anything different to the table. Again, not just in terms of the product, but in terms of what they can offer. So something that we did in the market was for people who aren't familiar with financing or using a buy now, pay later service in any kind of the verticals that we work in, you might look at them all and think that they're very similar. But the verticals that we focused on, we realized really had a need for additional training and support and ongoing engagement with their team members and with their head offices. So that's something that we really focused on building out. So on paper, our product might not look any different than the next guy. But in working with us, our partners are getting a lot more out of the service that way.
Something I love that you said like a little bit earlier was that the feeling, like the way that people make others feel about their product. How much would you say that like that emotional component comes into strategic partnerships and being able to create those?
Yeah, I think it comes into play a lot more than people think it does. Again, when people are looking at just a product on paper, there's not always a clear differentiator. And in the end of the day, when it comes down to the numbers, that's always going to be an important piece. But people buy from people that they like and trust. And a way to build that trust is to build that connection with someone, whether that's by earning their trust through being the expert when you come to the table, or just being really great at managing your conversations and communications with that person, being personable in meetings. If you put the same product on paper and you're able to match your competitors' pricing and they like working with you, you're going to win the business.
Love that. Okay, so what criteria should entrepreneurs look at to identify selecting the right partners that would complement their business and their strategies?
So all these things kind of have similar themes, but the biggest thing again is understanding what your product differentiator is, what value you think you bring to the market, and really defining what your goals and objectives are for that, and then trying to find partners that align with that goal. So whether that's having the same end goal or the same end objective, whether that's going into a new market, whether it's unlocking more potential in a market that you're currently in, whether it's satisfying a need that doesn't exist at all currently. Sometimes you can have co-collaborative objectives that will come to the same place if they're not right out the gate, the exact same goals. But it's important to find someone that you align with. Once you kind of have that foundation, then all of the other important steps will fall into place, like making sure that you outline your objectives very clearly from the start, set action items, and hold both parties accountable, things like that. But it's a lot easier for all of those to kind of fall into motion and have both parties be invested in them being successful if you're aligned on those goals.
Yeah. And something that you had mentioned earlier was data. I mean, all that data is just so powerful. So when someone is like approaching a potential partner within retail, what would you say are some of the key pieces that they should be presenting when it comes to data and those numbers?
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit different depending on, if it's retail that you're focused on, if it's a service that you offer, there's always going to be a little bit of variation there. But the biggest thing would be understanding the consumer trends. So whether that's usage rates, whether that's purchase average transaction size, or how many people are purchasing of that product. That would kind of be the biggest thing. The other thing I would say is really important for you to look for is feedback from the market. And these are things that are pretty easily accessible thanks to Google and kind of all those different search engines now, social media. But look for what the market's saying about who's already there. Are they happy with what current providers are doing? Are they looking for something different? What is the negative feedback? Because you can then take those pieces of information and position yourself or your product or your service to kind of respond to those trends or that feedback.
Love that. And so when it is that you are approaching, a relationship like this, it can always be wonderful to find a company that's very aligned, but is there, success in maybe collaborating with somebody who's considered a competitor? In which case, how can somebody navigate that type of conversation and approach that relationship?
Yeah, so there's definitely reasons to partner with a competitor. And I think the term competitor itself is kind of a broad spectrum, and that's what makes it kind of an interesting channel that people don't always explore. But kind of like I mentioned with financing, how from an outsider looking in, we might all look the same. For an example from humm, there's a lot of financing providers who have very different objectives from us. They're focused in different verticals. They're focused on different benefits with their product. And this is something that would occur in any market. You might look like you're offering the same thing, but you have different focus objectives. So we've partnered with businesses that we're able to send referrals to them for partners that we think are a better fit for their business than ours. No one wants to fully turn away a business, especially when you're trying to build relationships and build a reputation in the industry. But you also don't want to be taking on everything. If you say yes to everything, then you're not going to be doing the right things to keep yourself aligned with your goals and your objectives. And you want to make sure that you're holding true to what you believe your differentiator and value is. So if you can partner with a competitor where you're able to build that mutually beneficial relationship that allows you both to allocate your time and resources to focusing on your own objectives, it's beneficial for everyone, and your customers will feel it as well because they'll feel like they had a positive experience with you, even if they didn't end up working with you, because you direct them to someone who's a better fit.
Mhm. And so, how would you recommend to somebody to kind of like get over that mental hurdle of, because I feel like, you even said it, like the word competition, it's really a spectrum, but some people are just like competition bad. No, like, and it's just like almost like hitting like a head against the wall. Like this person is like almost like my enemy. So how would you, kind of like suggest to somebody to kind of reframe their mindset within that and approach that conversation?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to kind of dip your toes in the water with that is to find someone who is maybe not a direct competitor at first. Start with something that's more just a non-traditional partnership. We're seeing more and more of that coming up just with the way the world is changing. Digital era has brought in kind of all new opportunities in different markets, like financing and healthcare isn't something anyone would have thought of 5 years ago. So it's something that gives us an opportunity to start partnering with businesses that maybe wouldn't have been direct competitors, but they're very non-traditional people that you wouldn't have thought to work with. And by doing that, you start to kind of learn some nuances of how you can position your product as complementary. And then you can take that to kind of more and more closer to being a direct competition. And the best way to find out kind of the thought process of your competitors and find someone like we did, who on paper looks like a competitor, but really we're not focused on the same things at all, is like you mentioned in the very beginning, just network. Go meet people. Everyone on the other side of the table is doing the exact same thing that you're trying to do. And there's no harm in having conversations and just meeting people. So we find conferences really beneficial for that, just to kind of get in front of the right people and have a 30-second conversation. And people like to talk about their goals. So getting that kind of information from someone shouldn't be that difficult of a thing for you to do. The actual most difficult part is finding the right person to have that conversation with. But once you do, people like to talk about those kinds of things. So you should be able to find someone that you can be complimentary with.
So I love how you mentioned that, finding your space. So you guys, like you'll go to conferences because that 30 seconds can take, a cold email into a very warm, like, hi, remember me? And they're like, yes, absolutely, I do. Like, let's take this conversation forward.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about like a relationship that's been successful that you facilitated, and whether it be someone that was a competitor or even just a client who you onboarded and you were able to get them set up either on your platform or one of your partner platforms, and kind of how that was able to change the trajectory for their business?
Yeah. So we have a partner that we work with who is a leader in the healthcare space that traditionally was doing their own financing in-house. So it was something that, again, kind of ties in with those non-traditional partnerships where it's just historically been something that they've tried to take on. But when we see kind of where the economy is going these days, people have less disposable income. People are more cost conscious. People are getting more educated on how to best allocate their money. And sometimes it's not even a matter of being a worst case scenario to look for financing. It's just, is this a better use of my budget? So it's something that we find that consumers are asking more for, but we also find, and we all know, like the healthcare space is overburdened. Everyone's overworked. They're understaffed, and that's true for a lot of verticals, not just healthcare. But what we were able to do was build a solution for them that allowed them to not have the need to be managing all of that in-house without directly impacting their bottom line. So they're bringing in more customers by being able to offer that accessibility and affordability like we talked about earlier, and we're also making their day-to-day job easier. And then for us, it was great because they're an industry leader. We're able to pull a lot of the strategy that we built with them and now take those best practices to be more successful with other partners.
Wonderful. And I know that we've kind of already mentioned some pieces here and there, like accessibility and brand exposure. But can you go over some innovative ways that businesses can leverage these partnerships in
Mhm.
non-traditional ways?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that we see is those kind of non-traditional partnerships, like seeing the tech space being more popular in non-traditional markets like healthcare and auto. Global perspective is obviously a big thing now with everything being digital. It's a lot easier to go cross-border or international. So those are kind of common ones. But another really interesting one, and it can actually be supplementary to some of the other things that we talked about earlier, is working with more on the non-for-profit side. It kind of falls into a non-traditional partnership, but if you're really looking to highlight what your value is and align your goals within the market, working with an association or a non-for-profit business can be really beneficial for your exposure. And it can also give you a lot of insight into that specific market or industry that you're trying to tap into, and just make it so that you're aligned with that business.
And something that you had even mentioned earlier was a person being the difference in whether their business can get, business or get placed in certain like opportunities and things like that. So when it comes to utilizing yourself as part of your business, how can entrepreneurs kind of start tapping into that?
Mhm. The biggest thing that I find is the differentiator for the person is communication. You're going to find different ways with different people to build specific connections. You're going to find different things in different markets that are priority. Like I mentioned earlier, in kind of health, we found that it was really important to have ongoing support, which isn't something you traditionally get from a financing provider. So you'll find those little kind of niche pockets that you can address as you expand into different markets. But the biggest thing is just finding a way for effective communication. And that's, again, going to vary. There's some best practices that you can kind of start off with. But if you're effective in your communication, you're going to open up the other side of the partnership to be more effective in their communication with you. And then you start to build more of a relationship. And the stronger the relationship, the more leeway that partnership's going to have, the more forgiving they're going to be, the more invested they're going to be. So things like, celebrating wins, regular communication, make sure that you're making sure your actionables are tracked down and both parties are being held responsible, being really organized. People look for personality, of course, but when you can be the expert and the professional and make that partnership really easy for them, that's going to be a differentiator versus just a competitor who has slightly different pricing than you.
Yeah. And so when it comes to managing those relationships, what are the key components of effective communication in that type of partnership? I know you already mentioned, tracking your action items, like measuring your milestones, things like that. But are there any specific like processes or specific milestones that you would recommend to be able to have like more efficient and effective communication?
Yeah. So the other big piece of effective communication is transparency. So that's going to be really important, and as well as just the regular communication. So making sure that everything is clearly outlined from the beginning as to what the expectations are for the partnership, so that both parties understand what they're responsible for, and that everyone can then be given specific action items and they can check in on those touch points. Each partnership will be a little bit different, and it'll likely depend on the life cycle of your product or service. Or is it something that you're looking to restock a physical product quarterly? Are you looking to up a subscription to your services annually. So that'll kind of dictate the appropriate cadence for that communication. But a good best practice is always more is better than less in the beginning. So especially through a launch period and a new partnership, we always like to even start with weekly communications. You'll very quickly start to realize when those aren't necessary anymore, when you start to go through your checklist of what you've been going through for the last few meetings, and half an hour now only takes 5 minutes. But it's good to just have that. And when you set that expectation that that regular occurrence is going to happen, people also come prepared to the meeting because they know what to expect. So if you go through the same topics every meeting, set your schedule and address, last week's conversation, what your action items are for this week, what your action items are moving forward, forward thinking, whatever you think is appropriate to cover in that meeting, people know what's coming up and they'll come to the meeting more prepared, which makes it a better use of everyone's time, and it keeps them invested in the partnership so that everyone's feeling the success.
And I love how you just mentioned like ways to really manage expectations. Now, before someone even gets to the table, I think that, when we're dealing with a lot of solopreneurs, a lot of people just like take work on their on themselves and they're like, yeah, I got this all, like this is fine. But what's a more realistic approach, even if that is the case and that's something that they're going to maintain, what's a realistic way to approach the table in those relationships and set expectations in that are realistic and manageable?
Mm-hmm. It's something that we're all guilty of. We don't want to say no. We want to take it all on. And we feel like that we're bringing more to the table sometimes by taking it all on. But you also, like you mentioned, have to be realistic. And sometimes if you try and take it all on, then things aren't going to get done to the best of their ability, which is more detrimental than finding a way to fairly divide that. But I think the most important thing with your partner is making sure that they have actionables as well. A lot of the time we want to take it all on and say that, we'll manage all of it, sit back, and this is going to be a great partnership for you. But if they're not invested, and those actionables could be something really simple, but something that keeps them invested in the partnership. They're going to be invested in the success of it. They're going to be willing to take on more and more as they see the success of the partnership. And what those actual steps are going to be dictated by what your product is or that your service is. But it's really important that the partnership is mutual. If you're just doing everything, you might think that you're adding more to the partnership. But if someone just sits back and forgets about the partnership because you're doing everything, when it comes time for them to assess a new partner or renewing their membership with you or agreement with you, it's not going to be as easy for them to hesitate going to a new partner because they don't have a relationship with you if you're doing everything.
Yeah. And when it comes time to renewing those, agreements and, those partnerships, I'm, sure like, someone would come to the table with either like, their agenda or report of how that relationship has gone over maybe the last quarter or since you last signed the agreement. What would you say are like some key indicators that people should focus on that they would want the person to review and be like, oh yeah, success?
Yeah. So success is going to change throughout the duration of your partnership. We like to celebrate the first of everything. So if that's a partner with multiple locations, every single time that individual location uses us for the first time, that's a celebration. The first time someone makes a repeat sale, that's a celebration. And people like to see that. It's going to dwindle off as the partnership matures, but things like that, especially in the beginning, again, you're building that investment into the partnership. Then when you kind of figure out what the appropriate communication cadence is beyond that, whether it's a quarterly review or an annual review, you'll be able to start to look at the metrics from that time period. So whether that's the increase of usage versus the last comparison, and if it's a decrease in usage, what does that information give you? A decrease in sales or a decrease in usage isn't always a negative. Sometimes it's okay, we've taken this information and it's given us this feedback, and I'm bringing to the table not only this information, but an action plan for how to move forward. So it's really good to have those regular touch points and address those things head on, so that you're able to prevent issues from festering and becoming a bigger problem, and you're able to make everything a positive because you're controlling the narrative.
I like how you mentioned that sometimes like the wins can kind of like dwindle as the relationship matures. How would you recommend like, because sometimes I think that that could be like intimidating. Maybe it's like you get past year one and it's like, okay, maybe done, an excess of like 10% in sales. Like that's kind of just okay, but we haven't had any other major wins. How else could somebody define success as that relationship does, progress?
Yeah. So outside of just the sales metrics, some good things to look for, and that we typically touch on as well are feedback from your partner or your partner's end user. A lot of the times, the people that you're reviewing this type of information with might not be the end user. Maybe this is someone sitting in a corporate office, but it's their sales reps or their retail stores that are the ones who are actually interacting with your product and the end user purchasing your product. So they don't always have the same visibility, and a lot of time they are just looking at numbers. Numbers are always going to be an important metric, but we like to share things like, here's feedback we've gotten that's very positive that we can use to continue to move forward, or here's some feedback we've gotten that opens up a great idea for us to pivot our objectives and potentially open up a brand new market. So taking any kind of feedback that you can get, either from the middle user or the end user, is going to be a great metric as well. And then also looking at just industry trends in general. It might not specifically be your product, but you can look at things like, okay, we're seeing an increase of usage in this type of product overall in the market. So what do we need to do to unlock more potential with our product? You can pull positives from different areas that aren't necessarily just your sales numbers.
Yeah. And when it comes to balancing the importance between data and feedback, not like what is like the most important, but which one would you say carries the most weight?
I think it's actually important to present them together because data sometimes, if it's not presented correctly, can be left to interpretation. And the interpretation's always going to be at the bias of whoever it is you're presenting to. If you're presenting to someone who is like a CFO, they're going to look at it just as dollars and cents. And because that's their lane and it's not their job to look at the other factors. Someone else at the company might be more well-rounded. But I think the most important piece is combining the two so that you're creating the narrative and you're saying, here's the data we have, here's the other factors that we can contribute to that to either outline our success or outline our need for an action item or a pivot. But presenting them both keeps you in the control. So it's important to have both.
Yeah, and even with what you just mentioned about biases. So when it comes time to approaching these tables, I think something that I see a lot of the time from entrepreneurs is they'll have like 20 different decks coming to the table to say like, yeah, like this is why we're perfect for you. But even what you just mentioned is that each person can be so different. So, and that can be a lot of time, energy, resources put into creating such a thing. So would you recommend that somebody creates, many different assets that are tailored to one organization that they want to partner with? Or should they kind of just pour into what it is that makes their business and what makes it special and kind of hope that it translates?
I definitely think the latter is more important. I don't think it's possible for people to do everything well. And when you try and do too many things at once, likely something is lacking, and the end user or your partner is going to feel that. So there's ways that you can put variations on your product without compromising your core value and your core differentiator. When you try and make a product 100 different ways that fits into specific markets, if that doesn't work, then what are you going to do with it? But if you're focused on your core values and you maybe find a slight differentiation for this market that we want to focus on, or we find a lot that, for example, with Hum, we thought healthcare would be kind of one product, but now we're seeing that, well, orthodontics work a lot differently than audiology. So it's our same core product and our same core value that we're bringing to each, but we're seeing that because audiology has an elderly population, the way we train those people to use our product is different than how we train orthodontics, which are typically a younger audience. So there's ways for you to put variations on your product to meet those kind of niche needs without having to compromise the core value and create 1,000 variations of things that you're just doing mediocre.
Yeah. And so when you're putting together like your assets to approach, whether it be, Hum or Indigo or Target, like whatever the organization ends up being, what would you say is like the most important assets that somebody should bring with them to have that conversation, or to even just get an email open and get a response?
Yeah, so the initial conversation, like we said, is the hardest part. And a lot of the time, I do find that you need to get in front of that person even for 3 seconds before you can really push that conversation forward. A great way through email, if it's a cold email, you don't have the opportunity to get in front of people. LinkedIn is a great tool. People are more likely to respond to something if they see that they have a connection to you in some way. So a lot of the times I'll work my way up the chain. If I'm trying to get a connection with someone that I know is the decision maker at the top of a business, I will connect with people who maybe have the same role as me because they know what I'm doing. So they're more willing to accept that invitation and maybe start a conversation or point me in the right direction. And they know that you're not expecting them to do anything, but they'll help you up, and they would expect the same in return. So that's a great way to kind of work your way up to the right person if you don't have the opportunity to get in front of them. And when you have that connection in some way, and maybe it's not LinkedIn, maybe for your market it makes more sense to be a social media platform, but finding a connection to that person first just makes them all the more likely to open your email. And in your email, it's important to, that's not your sales pitch. You're in your email, you're just looking to build an initial connection with someone, spark their interest with something. So give them one little piece of what you think your product does differently, or how it brings value, or how it solves a need or problem that you think that they might be experiencing, just enough to spark their interest to get them to have an actual conversation with you. And then I would say, if you're going to tailor anything about your product or your service, that's what you tailor. You tailor your conversation in your sales deck and your pitch presentations to that specific person, because different types of decision makers are going to look for different pieces of information. If you're approaching different kind of verticals, they're going to look for different information. You can have the same product that you're selling to all of them, but that would be the piece that you would custom to that vertical.
I want to just like pedal back for a second and touch on what you just said about LinkedIn, and how when you want to, get in touch with somebody who like does make the decision, sometimes you don't go directly to that person because they might just be like, I don't have time for this. But sometimes the strategic partnership really is just someone who is like completely at your level, and then that person can bump you up. Can you kind of like run me through that like a little bit more? How can somebody maximize a relationship where someone's at the same level in order to get to the next?
Yeah, I would say the what you'd be looking for out of someone who's at the same level is to understand that partnership. So how their company works, maybe if they've worked with someone similar to what your business offers, did that work for them? Has that person heard any positive or negative feedback? Just kind of getting as much information as you can about how their business works and how your product might be able to fit in. You're not trying to sell to them, so it's very easy to just ask them open-ended questions and see what kind of information they're willing to share with you. And a lot of the times when you're looking at these entry-level or middle-level employees, they're more willing to give stuff up, because what do they have to lose? They don't control it. So they're willing to talk to you about the feedback that they've heard, or Sometimes it's just as simple as knowing what competitor they are working with, if that's not something that's easier for you to just identify on your own. And then, when you go into the conversation with the decision maker, when you finally get there, okay, I know what I do better than this competitor, so I know what important pieces to speak to. Or because they are already using a competitor, you know that you can speak to them a little bit differently than someone who has never used your type of product before. So you can get really important pieces of information from those people who aren't at the top, so that you're prepared for those conversations when you get there.
Amazing. Um, we are just about to hit time. I see somebody does have their hand up, so I do want to take one question. If Keisha Green, I don't know if you have a question or if you just happened to put your hand up or wanted, high fives, but and if not, then that's okay. I can even just take a scroll through to see if there is any questions. But actually, sorry, here's one that I actually did see. Which conferences would you recommend for 2024?
That is going to be very specific as to what vertical or industry you work in. And it also depends on what your target market is. There's industry conferences are always the best ones for us. I think that's the most important thing to look at when you look for a conference. If you're looking to build those partnerships and get in front of the right people, then you want to go to a conference that's designed for industry continuing education or industry networking. You don't want to go to one that's designed for the clients or the end user, because you're likely not going to have the right people at that conference for you to meet with. So that's what I would recommend is singling out the ones that are focused on that.
And while humm is in Canada and is expanding within Canada, do you go to conferences in the US as well, or are you just
Yeah, we
focused
have.
on being here in
Yeah, so
Canada?
there's different reasons to go to different conferences in the US. Even if your market's not the US, we find that there's a lot of good continuing education opportunities in the US. Things like industry trends. So there's a vet conference where they talk about how technology is being implemented into the veterinary space and kind of what the forward thinking trends are. And those are always good things for you to understand if that's a market that you're focused on, or any other market that kind of talks about those topics, because it allows you to kind of plan for your product as well. So when it's education based, I don't really think that the country matters, because it's not talking about anything that wouldn't be relevant in Canada as well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lindsay, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.